The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by quoting a Yerushalmi which says, Minayin, from where do we know the concept of the Dalit Koisus? It means, where do we have a remez in the Torah for the 4 cups that we have on the night of Pesach? Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Noah, says that it corresponds to the 4 Geulos. That is, the 4 expressions of Geula that are mentioned in the Parsha when the Yidden are told about Geulas Mitzrayim. As the Pasuk says, the Eibishter says to Moshe Rabbeinu, L'chein emor, tell the Yidden, V'yitzesi, etc., V'yitzalti, V'go'alti, V'lakachti. In addition to this first reason, there are other reasons given in the Gemara there as well. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says it's corresponding to the 4 cups of Paroi. This means the 4 cups that are mentioned in the dream of the Sarah Mashkim and its interpretation, where there are 4 times the word Kois mentioned in connection to Paroi. Reb Levi says it corresponds to the 4 Malchios, to the 4 different governments that ruled the Yidden over the times of Golus. The Rabbanon say it corresponds to the 4 cups of punishment that Hashem is going to give the Goyim to drink in the future, and corresponding to that 4 cups of comfort that Hashem will give to the Bnei Yisrael. Now, simply says the Rebbe, the difference between all of these other reasons and the first reason that said it's corresponding to the 4 Geulos, the 4 Lashonis of Geula, is that according to the other reasons, these 4 cups don't have a direct, open, revealed Zeicha to the Geula of Bnei Yisrael, to the Geula out of Mitzrayim. As opposed to the reason connected the Dalit Geulos, then the 4 cups are directly a Zeicher to the Inyan, to the expressions of Geula. Based on this, says the Rebbe, we could say that this machloikus, as far as the remes for the 4 koisos, is actually going to be a nafkamina, a difference also in halacha. But by first prefacing, the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch, in regards to the dinim of Heseba, when does a person need to recline? When he's having the kazayis of matzah, when he has the koirech, when he has the afikoimon, and when he drinks the dalit koisos. Says the Alter Rebbe, because all of these things are a zeicher for Geula and Cheirus, Geula for redemption, for freedom. The Alter Rebbe goes on to say that these Dalit Koisos, the Chachamim, were Mesakein, corresponding to 4 Lashonis of Geula that say in Parshas Vo'era. Vo'itzesi, V'go'alti, V'lakachti, V'hitzalti. Note, by the way, the Alter Rebbe says these 4 expressions in a different order, which the Rebbe will get to soon. Says the Alter Rebbe further, therefore they need to have Heseba, reclining in a way of freedom. However, the rest of the Su'udah, if a person wants to eat and drink without reclining, so Harishus Biyodoi, he has the option to do that. Nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe says, Hameisev B'chol, the one who reclines the rest of the Su'udah as well, Hareza Meshubach, this is praiseworthy, and he's doing a mitzvah min hamufchar. From the language of the Alter Rebbe, it seems obvious that the Alter Rebbe is trying to explain to us the reason of Heseba that's needed by these 4 things. By, again, the matzah and the koyrech, the afikoyman and the 4 cups. Because they are a zeicher for Geula and Cheirus and freedom, and that's why they need to have Heseba, they need to have reclining in a way, in a show of freedom. However, says the Rebbe, we need to understand, in this very simon, in an earlier seif, the Alter Rebbe had already explained the reason for Heseba. The Alter Rebbe had already said that we sit Heseba reclining in a way of Cheirus because in every generation a person needs to show by himself as if he had just gone out of the slavery of Mitzrayim, and therefore you need to do all of the things on this night in a way of Cheirus. So seemingly we don't need any more reason why we need to have Heseba reclining when we're having the kazayis matzah and so on, because this is already understood from the Alter Rebbe had told us earlier. If anything, what needs to be explained is why we don't need to necessarily be reclining. It's optional to recline by the rest of the Su'udah, but that's not what it sounds like the Alter Rebbe is trying to tell us. It sounds like he's telling us why we do need to recline for these things, but he told us the reason already. Question number 2. Why is the Alter Rebbe giving us the reference, the source that these Lashonis say in Parshas Vo'era? Usually the Alter Rebbe doesn't tell us inside the Shulchan Aruch the place of the psukim that he's bringing. And finally, the point that we mentioned already earlier, that in Parshas Vo'era these 4 Lashonis say in a different order. It says Vo'itzesi, V'itzalti, V'go'alti, V'lakachti. That's also the way they're brought in the Yerushalmi that was mentioned before. Why is it that the Alter Rebbe is changing the order? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this all by first clarifying a general concept in regards to the Geder, to the whole definition of Heseba, of reclining, which generally we could explain this in two different ways. And the Rebbe is going to explain Nafkemina is practically, Lahalacha, as well as the proof to each one of these ways and so on. One way of understanding it is that Heseba, reclining, is not an obligation in it for it as its own obligation. Rather, it's a detail within the eating matzah and drinking the dalat koises. That is, that just like there are details in how much matzah and wine you need to have, and the eichos, the quality, what the matzah is all about, what the wine is and so on, so too, there is conditions in how you need to eat it and drink it. That is, you need to eat it and drink it in a way of Heseba. That's one way of understanding it. A second way of understanding it is no. Heseba is actually a mitzvah for itself. A person needs to show on this night freedom, so he needs to recline. And that's why he's showing the show of freedom when he's eating and drinking while reclining. However, we say you're not going to be yotzeh this mitzvah properly unless you did it while having the matzah and the wine. That means, in other words, the matzah and the wine then are like a detail within the general mitzvah of Heseba. So again, the first way of understanding it is that Heseba is only a detail in a requirement within the eating and drinking of matzah and wine. The second way is, no, Heseba is a complete mitzvah for itself. Part of the conditions of Heseba is, when do we do it? A detail of that mitzvah is that we do it while having the matzah and the wine. What's the practical difference? So let's say a person had the kazayis of matzah. He had in mind to eat it for the mitzvah of matzah, but he didn't actually recline. Do we say he was yotzeh or not? If we say that Heseba, reclining, is an absolute integral part of the eating of the matzah, then if he didn't recline, he wasn't yotzeh the mitzvah of matzah midrabanan, that is, of course. Because the mitzvah midaraisa is to eat matzah, the Rabbanan said you have to recline. Because according to the Rabbanan, according to the Chachamim, the Heseba is actually something that must be done while eating the matzah. However, if we would say that the Heseba is really a mitzvah for itself, while you're having a Heseba, to do that properly, you have to have matzah. So if you did not recline, what you missed out on was the mitzvah of Heseba, the reclining, not the mitzvah of matzah. What would be the practical difference then? Lahalacha lemaisa. So let's say the person ate the kazayis without reclining. The halacha is that he has to eat it again reclining. But what about the bracha of alachilas matzah? Does he have to make that bracha again? If we say that the obligation to eat the matzah is in order to fulfill the mitzvah of reclining properly, but the matzah that I ate, I was yotzeh 100%, then there's no point in making another bracha alachilas matzah. I was yotzeh the mitzvah of alachilas matzah. However, if we say that what you missed out is in doing the mitzvah of matzah properly, if I didn't have reclining, then I actually need to make another bracha alachilas matzah. Another practical difference. So let's say the person ate the kazayis matzah without reclining. Then, when he's about to have the matzah again with reclining, now the situation had changed and now he's not obligated anymore to recline. For example, he's sitting in front of his Rebbe, which the halacha then is, you don't need to recline. Does he need to eat the matzah again? And not recline. That is, if the problem was that he wasn't yotzeh the mitzvah of matzah properly when he ate it without reclining, in other words, it was a din in the matzah and he says if he didn't eat the matzah, so since at the time he was obligated in reclining and he didn't recline, he wasn't yotzeh the mitzvah of matzah, so now he needs to eat matzah again, even though now he's not going to recline, but he wasn't yotzeh the mitzvah of matzah before. However, if we say that the first time he was yotzeh the mitzvah of matzah, what he wasn't yotzeh is the mitzvah of Heseba, and now he's anyways exempt from reclining, then there's no point in eating matzah again without reclining when the matzah he was yotzeh 100% already before. It's the reclining he wasn't yotzeh. And now he's not going to be yotzeh reclining anyways because he's not going to be reclining in front of his Rebbe. Says the Rebbe, we could try to prove that the obligation for Heseba, for reclining, is a detail within the matzah from the following Gemara. The Gemara is discussing a waiter. And the Gemara says a waiter that ate a kazayis matzah while reclining, then he's yotzeh. The Gemara says, Meisev ein, if he reclined, yes. If he did not recline, he's not yotzeh. Which seems to be obvious that what he's not yotzeh if he didn't recline is the mitzvah of matzah. Because it would be very, very difficult to say that what the Gemara means, he's not Yoitza reclining. If he's not Yoitza reclining, what does the Gemara even mean to say? If he reclined, he's Yoitza. If he didn't recline, he's not Yoitza. It's quite obvious. If he didn't recline, he's not Yoitza, the mitzvah of reclining. So we have to say that what he wasn't Yoitza is the matzah he wasn't Yoitza. The Rebbe says we can also see this clearly in the following Rosh. The Rosh is discussing if a person drank the third or the fourth cup and he wasn't reclining. Does he have to drink again reclining? The problem could be that it's near, it seems as if he might be adding to the amount of cups that the Chachamim were misakin. Chachamim said 4 cups and now he's having more cups. However, says the Rosh, since he drank the cups, we could say the following. Since he drank the cups not in the proper way as according to the Takana, so it was clear that that's not part of the koisos, and what he's drinking now is, when he's drinking while reclining, that's the kois that he's drinking and has an obligation. What do we see clearly? That the Rosh says that when he drinks without reclining, it's not counted as one of the koisos. Not that he wasn't yotze to the reclining. The kois isn't counted, which seems to be clear then that the mitzvah of reclining was part of the way to be yotze, the koisos, and the same thing of course would be true with the matzah as well, that the reclining is a detail of the matzah, and not that the reclining was a separate obligation for itself, and that I was yotze, the matzah or the wine, even if I didn't recline. The Rebbe says, arguably we could try to prove a similar thing also from the following Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says, a person is yotze when he has the matzah, whether he had kavanah or he didn't have kavanah. Since he was reclining, so the chazaka is, we assume that for sure he had kavanah, because why else was he reclining? He was reclining because he's supposed to recline for the mitzvah, so therefore, obviously, he had in mind initially that it was for the mitzvah of matzah. In other words, even if while I was eating the matzah, I wasn't mamish having in mind for the mitzvah, but since he was reclining, the chazaka is that I originally did have kavanah. Now I sort of forgot about it for a moment, but automatically my eating now is following my original kavanah. Now, if we should say that really a person can be yotze to the mitzvah of matzah without reclining, then why is the Gemara automatically assuming and says, since he reclined, then he's yotze? Just like he didn't have in mind now for the mitzvah, isn't it possible, and maybe even very, very logical, that he actually did not recline? Why is the Gemara assuming that he reclined? Seemingly the Gemara should say that if he reclined, then, regardless if he had kavanah, then he's yotze. So we must say that the Gemara doesn't even have to say that he reclined, because if he didn't recline, he's of course not yotze the mitzvah. And that's what the Gemara is saying. Since he reclined, we're assuming that he definitely had kavanah. So seemingly this Gemara could also be a proof that reclining is an integral part of the mitzvah of matzah. However, the Rebbe says this is not an absolute proof. We don't have to say that imkivin means that he definitely was reclining. Rather, mikivin shehesiv could definitely mean that we're speaking about a case when he reclined, so then this would be the halacha that even if he didn't have kavanah, he's yotze. But if he didn't recline, all of this wouldn't apply. In other words, the Yerushalmi could definitely just be being brief about what it's saying, which is the style of the Yerushalmi, and it doesn't have to say if he reclined. Rather, we're speaking about in a case when he reclined, then we'll assume that he's yotze, but not necessarily do we have to say that the Gemara is assuming that he definitely reclined, and therefore this Yerushalmi not necessarily would be a proof to say that without reclining you're not yotze the mitzvah of matzah. So far in the Sicha, the Rebbe was proving, at least according to the previous proof, that the chiyuv, that the obligation of a seiba is not an obligation for itself, rather it's a part of the eating of the matzah and the drinking of the wine. Now the Rebbe looks at it the other way, that seemingly we can also prove the opposite as well, that a seiba is a mitzvah for itself, and that eating matzah and wine, that's a condition of when we have to, when is the heseba, when does a seiba apply? So part of the condition of a seiba is that we do it while having matzah and wine, but not that the heseba is part of the mitzvah of matzah and wine. Rather, heseba is a mitzvah for itself. Says the Rebbe, this could be proven from the other part of the halacha, that we say that when a person is reclining for the rest of the meal, we said harezim meshubach, that's praiseworthy, and that's considered mitzvah min hamufchar. If we should say that the whole idea of Heseba is only a condition of the way we eat matzah, the matzah of mitzvah and the wine, then why would we say it's great to have Heseba by the rest of the Suda? If Heseba is not a chiyuv for itself, it's only a condition in matzah, then what's the point of Heseba the rest of the Suda? So seemingly then we have to say that there is an obligation in Heseba for itself, and its main obligation is when we have a matzah and the wine, but as well as the rest of the Suda would be a mitzvah min hamufchar. However, the Rebbe says we could possibly push off this proof as well, because generally on Yom Tov the whole Su'udah is a mitzvah. Just like there's a mitzvah to be Mechabed Shabbos and to have Tainug on Shabbos, so too on Yom Tov we have a special mitzvah of having Simcha, we have to have meat and wine and fruit, delicacies and so on and so forth. And therefore, says the Rebbe, it's possible to say that just like Heseba is an absolute necessity for the eating of the matzah, so the rest of the Su'udah, which is also a very important part on Yom Tov, we could say that the mitzvah min hamufchar, Heseba, is a condition part of the rest of the Su'udah as well. In other words, we have a mitzvah of Oinig and Simchas Yom Tov on this night. A part of that mitzvah could be that you do it beheseba. In other words, again, just like we said before, that matzah and wine are obligations for themselves, and as a detail of that, we have a seba. We could possibly say the same thing regarding the rest of the Su'udah. That the mitzvah min hamufchar, you want to have the Su'udas Yom Tov properly, then you do it in the way of a seba. However, the Rebbe continues to try to still say that Heseba is a mitzvah for itself. And that is, the Rambam says, and so too the Alter Rebbe brings, that b'chol doir v'doir chayev odom laharis esatzmai, a person needs to show by himself, within himself, as if he just went out of Shibud Mitzrayim. Lefichach, therefore, when he has the meal on this night, he needs to eat and drink in a way and recline in a way of chayrus. In other words, since we're saying this is part of chayev laharis esatzmai, it's as a general thing on this night, that the person needs to act in a way of chayrus, so therefore, definitely, this is an obligation for itself. And as a result of this obligation, this idea of showing chayrus, part of this is that we need to eat and drink in a way of Heseba. And therefore, Heseba definitely is not just a detail within the matzah and the wine, but it is an obligation for itself. Part of the laharis esatzmoi to show that you just went out of Mitzrayim. So to summarize, it seems to be that each one of these sides is sort of very, very, very strong. On the one hand, yes, it's definitely a chiyuv for itself, but on the other hand, we also clearly saw that it's a detail within the obligation of eating matzah and wine. In order to put these two things together, and they shouldn't be contradicting to each other, says the Rebbe, that really there's two aspects in Heseba. There's two obligations. There's one as a chiyuv and a mitzvah for itself, just to recline. And there's a second aspect where it becomes a detail within the eating matzah and the drinking of the wine. So when the person is having the matzah and the wine, be'eseba, he is fulfilling the mitzvah of eating matzah properly. He's also fulfilling that special obligation of heseba as a mitzvah for itself. When the person is having the heseba as it's an inyan for itself, there is the Iker mitzvah of how you do Heseba, and that is, how do you do Heseba properly? That is when you're having matzah and the wine. That's the main way how you do Heseba. As a mitzvah min hamufchar, again as part of the mitzvah for Heseba separately, as a mitzvah min hamufchar of that mitzvah, it's also for the rest of the meal. That means it's a hidur in the mitzvah of Heseba. So again, we have two things. There's one thing that in order for me to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah properly, I need to have heseba. There's another chiyuv, I need to have heseba on this night. And in order to have heseba properly on this night, it needs to be done primarily by the matzah, but the mitzvah min hamufchar, I will fulfill that obligation if I do it also by the rest of the meal as well. Says the Rebbe, based on this, we can understand very, very nicely and very geschmack the words of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe first speaks about that when a person is sitting down and reclining derech cherus, because b'chol doir v'doir, as the Rambam quoted, you have to show yourself as if you just went out of Mitzrayim, and therefore everything on this night has to be in a way of freedom. That means it's a general obligation that applies to the whole night. And based on this, the heseba that comes out is not a detail of the eating of matzah. It's a separate chiyuv for itself. I need to be reclining on this night. Then, a few sifim later, the Alter Rebbe is starting to speak about which things need heseba. Because when the Alter Rebbe said before that you need to have heseba, that was just the heseba as an obligation for itself. But here, the Alter Rebbe is now starting to discuss the second aspect of heseba as it's a detail in the mitzvah of eating matzah. And as the Alter Rebbe concludes by saying, Lefichach heim tzrichen heseba derecherus, that these things need to have heseba. He doesn't say Lefichach tzarich lahasev bahem, but they themselves need the heseba. That means that as a result of the reason that's being given in this if, which we're going to discuss in a moment, these mitzvahs need heseba. What is the reason? What are the reason for these mitzvahs? The Alter Rebbe says, Lefisha kol dvarim elu, because these things, the matzah and the wine, are a zeicher for geula and cherus. That means, because the content of these very things is a zeicher for geula and cherus, therefore they need to have heseba. You need to be doing this in a way of cherus as a condition. So because the zeicher legeula and cherus within these things should be perfect in every single way, I also need to be reclining. In other words, again, let's just summarize. First, the Alter Rebbe was speaking about the general chiyuv of the night to have heseba and cherus because sarich liros kilu yotzim and mitzrayim, etc. Now the Alter Rebbe is discussing another thing. Because the matzah and the wine specifically are there for geula and cherus, that's why they need as part of themselves the detail of the inyan of heseba. The Alter Rebbe then goes on to prove that this is all connected to Geula, that these things are connected to Geula in connection to the Dalet Koises. What does the Alter Rebbe say? Because why are the Dalet Koises, why were they established? They were established for the Lashonis of Geula that are said in Parshas Va'era, which therefore shows us that this mitzvah is directly connected to the inyan of Geula and Cherus, that the Dalet Koises are there for Geula and Cherus. And that's why, as a condition of the Dalet Koises, you need to have the heseba. Whereas, going back to the beginning of the Sicha and the Yerushalmi, if it was only because of the other reasons of the Dalet Koisos, whether the 4 cups of Paroi in the dream of the Sarah Mashkim, whether it's the 4 Malchias, whether it's the 4 cups of punishment that the Eibush is going to punish the Goyim, and the 4 cups of comfort for the Yidden, all of these reasons are then not connected directly to the inyan of Geula and Cherus of Yidden. So the Alter Rebbe is therefore trying to tell us, why we need to have heseba as a condition of the mitzvah of Dalet Koises. So that's why he's emphasizing and telling us that why do we have these Dalet Koises? Because of the 4 Lashonis of Geula, again, as opposed to the other 4 reasons. Says the Rebbe, this is why the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing that it says in Parshas Va'era, the Alter Rebbe is not just barely trying to give us a source for these Lashonis, where it says, the Alter Rebbe is trying to explain this idea that it's all connected to Geula, because as we said, only based on this we understand that since we say that the Chachamim established it based on Geula, that's why we say the heseba is as a condition of the 4 koisos, as opposed again to the other reasons. Says the Alter Rebbe, because it says in Parshas Va'era. What is Parshas Va'era about? Parshas Va'era is about the Geula and the going out of the Yidden out of Mitzrayim. So the Alter Rebbe is saying it's corresponding to these 4 Lashonis of Geula. The Chachamim established the 4 cups on the night of the Geula. But again, as opposed to the other reasons, the 4 cups of Pari and so on, clearly these things have nothing to do with the idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Says the Rebbe, however, it's still not fully understood. Because what the Rebbe is about to discuss is that seemingly the 4 cups are also connected to other things, that the Chachamim were mesaken how we drink these 4 cups. We know that these 4 cups need to be drunk, the halachas, they need to be drunk in order. That is, you have different things we say for each cup. Between the first and the second cup, between the third and the 4th cup, there needs to be the interruptions of saying the Haggadah, the Hallel. We have between the second and the third, we have the eating of matzah, we bench, because each one of these cups were established for something very, very, very specific. Now that would seem to imply that there is something else in the Dalet Koisais other than the Inyan of Geula and Cherus. We're having all these other things that we're associating with the Dalet Koisais. So seemingly, here we would just say that the Dalet Koisais are exclusively connected to the Inyan of Cherus, but seemingly there's some other Inyanim here as well. Says the Rebbe, this is why the Alter Rebbe changed the order of the four Lashonos. And he says, V'itzeisi, v'go'alti, v'lakachti, v'itzalti. He's changing it from the way it says in the Pasuk, V'itzeisi, v'itzalti, v'go'alti, v'lakachti. The Alter Rebbe over here is going to be explaining how these four Koisos and the four Lashonos are in the order of how they were established, of how we do them in the Geula, in the Haggadah, because it's specifically these four expressions that are going to explain to us what we're doing with each one of the four Koisos and what we're doing by the Seder in each one of these four Koisos. And then we're going to understand that all four Koisos, yes, even though we seem to be doing them for other things, but they're all still connected directly to these four Lashonos, and therefore they're still all directly connected to Geula. And the Rebbe explains the connection between what we do for the four Koisos and how they're connected to these four Lashonos in this order. The first cup, we say Kiddush on it. What do we say in Kiddush? Zeicher li'tzias Mitzrayim. That corresponds to the first one of the four Lashonos, V'hoitzeisi. I'm going to take them out of Mitzrayim. The second cup, we read the Haggadah. And of course, the special way how we tell the story on the night of Pesach, how we say the Zeicher li'tzias Mitzrayim, although we mention Yitzias Mitzrayim every single day, is that on the night of Pesach, we need to do it Ba'arichos, at length, with lots of explanation. Says the Rebbe, therefore, this corresponds to the second one of the Lashonos, V'go'alti, which, what's the V'go'alti? This is the whole idea of how the Pasuk is describing at great length all of the amazing, amazing miracles and wonders of Yitzias Mitzrayim. As the Pasuk itself says, by the V'go'alti, it doesn't just say V'go'alti, it gives us the details. V'go'alti eschem, I'm going to redeem you, B'zroi anatuya, with an outstretched arm, with B'shvatim G'dolim, with great judgments and so on, with punishments, with all the miracles that are going to happen. In other words, the whole Haggadah is in these words of what says by V'go'alti eschem, of how it's all going to take place with all of those miracles. And how do we conclude the whole Haggadah? Again connected to V'go'alti. We concluded the bracha asher go'alonu v'go'al esaviseinu, and Baruch Ato Hashem Go'al Yisrael. So that's all the V'go'alti. Comes the third cup. The third cup, we bench Birchas HaMazon, in which we're thanking Hashem for Al Toiros Chosheli Madetanu, for the Torah that He taught us. The halach is, if He didn't mention Torah in Birchas HaMazon, He actually not Yoitza. This would correspond to the third Lashon. Again, in the order the way the Alter Rebbe brings them. First, Voitzeisi, then V'go'alti. Now the Alter Rebbe brings V'lakachti. Hashem says, I'm going to take you as my nation, I'm going to be your Eibishter. This is referring to Matan Torah. As it says, you're becoming Hashem's nation. And finally, the fourth cup, on which we say Hallel, and we make the bracha, the Birchas Hashir, we say at the end of Hallel, which is mainly connected to the Geula Hasidah, and that's why we actually start with Shvoi Chamascha. This is all hinted in the V'hitzalti, a general saving of the Yidden, where we don't go into the details. It just says, I'm going to save you from your hard work. And this is specifically referring to the Geula Hasidah. Whereas the Rambam tells us that everything that's going to happen by the Geula Hasidah, we don't know exactly how it's going to happen until it's going to happen. These are all things that are hidden and closed up by the Nevi'im. So this corresponds to the general V'hitzalti, the general saving of the Yidden. What therefore comes out of all of this is that even the specific things we do with all the four Koisos are very much connected to the four Lashonos of Geula, in the order, if we put it in the order the way the Alter Rebbe said it. And therefore, it's all still connected to the concept of Geula and Cherus, which is what we were trying to say, that all four cups are connected to the Geula and Cherus. And therefore, we're back to the original point that the whole takana of the Dalet Koisos, both generally, why to have four cups, corresponding to the four Lashonos of Geula, and also the details of what we do with the four cups, we now see clearly how they're all very much connected to the union of Geula and Cherus, because again, even the details that we do with the four cups are still back connected to the four Lashonos of Geula. Says the Rebbe to explain the difference of these four Lashonis. It's explained in Likutei Torah that we have four levels in tshuva, which are hinted in the pasuk Sur Meira va'asei toiv bake sholem v'ratfei. Sur Meira, staying away from bad, refers to the idea that we shouldn't cause damages and blemishes with our aveiros, that we do begashmias, machshava, dibur, u'maisa, and that we need to do tshuva for them. We need to regret the past. We need to uproot any desire we have for this bad. We shouldn't be wanting chas v'shalom to separate from the unity of Hashem, but rather there should be gilui elikus, and this generally corresponds to the level of memali kol almin. Then comes in the pasuk va'asei toiv. Here we're doing tshuva for chas v'shalom, missing out on doing properly a va'asei toiv, to work harder in our Torah, in our tefillah, and that over here we're doing tshuva that we should bring back the oir, that oir that was missing by missing out of mitzvah sazeh. So we now missed out on an oir. For this we need a much greater tshuva to connect to the Shem Hashem, which goes even beyond the level of mamali kol almin, and this is the level of soiviv kol almin, the level of makif. Says the Alter Rebbe, these two levels of tshuva are still considered tshuva tato, still dealing with our actions. Then comes bake sholem. Bake sholem is a higher form of tshuva, and this is primarily done through Torah, which on Torah is connected to sholem, as we say that when you're learning Torah properly, you're bringing sholem both in the upper realms and in the lower realms, etc. Through Torah, you're reaching atzmus oirein soif, which is higher than mamali kol almin and soiviv kol almin. Why did we say there's another two levels? Because Torah itself has two parts. There's nigla de Torah and pnimiyas Torah. So we have four levels over here. Again, sur meira, asay toiv, and two levels in Torah. It's explained in Oira Torah from the Tzemach Tzedek that the Dalet Koisos also correspond to the four levels of tshuva. So based on this, the four Lashonos would then also have to correspond to these four levels of tshuva. Voitzeisi v'itzalti v'galti v'lakachti. So voitzeisi eschem mitachas sivlois Mitzrayim is going out from under the tumah of Mitzrayim. This is the concept of sur meirav, staying away from bad. V'itzalti, although v'itzalti simply means saving, the Rebbe brings over that v'itzalti is also from the word of tzeil, which means like a shade or a shadow, representing something that's makif, something that's a shade that's covering you from above to protect you, represents the union of soiviv kol almin, which comes down through mitzvahs. As the pasuk says, "Uvetzeil yodik Sicha," and it's referring to mitzvahs. I'm protecting you with the shade of my hand. Then comes v'go'alti. Go'alti refers to Torah, as the Razal tell us. Ein l'cha ben chayre, there's no free man unless someone that's involved in learning Torah. More specifically, it would be nigla de Torah, as simply what the Chazal seem to be speaking about. And finally, v'lokachti eschem lilam, I'm going to take you for myself as a nation. This is the ultimate union that happens between a Yid and the Eibishter, specifically when he's learning Pnimiyas HaTorah, and as it says, v'lokachti eschem li, and the Chazal tell us that when it says li, it refers to something permanent that never changes and never moves, because here we're speaking about a level that goes completely beyond any changes and divisions, referring to the level of Pnimiyas HaTorah, where we say there's no questions over there, there's no machloikus over there. And that's why v'lokachti eschem li loam, that ultimate greatest level, is referring to Pnimiyas HaTorah. Says the Rebbe, since these are four levels of tshuva, and generally in tshuva we're going mulmato l'mayla, so therefore from below to above, we're climbing the ladder. So therefore these four lashonos are said in that order. Voitzeisi v'itzalti. So we have the mitzvahs loisase, staying away from the bad, the mitzvahs aseh, then going to the learning of nigla de Torah, which we said is v'go'alti, and finally v'lokachti, the union of pnimiyas HaTorah. However, says the Rebbe, the order of these four levels in avodah really is also going to depend on the chashivus, on the importance we give, and the quality in the difference between practical action and learning. Because we know that there's a general discussion about this, which one is greater, action or learning. If learning is more important than action, so that's the highest on the ladder. So then v'go'alti and v'lokachti, that refers to the two different levels of learning, nigla Torah and pnimiyas HaTorah, they're going to be last, because we're counting mulmato l'maylo. If action is more important, then the hitzalti we said, which is the tzeil, which is the mitzvah saseh, then action is more important, then that one's going to come last because it is the highest one. Just important to point out, Voitseisi is going to be first. Either way, as the Rebbe points out in the Ha'ara, because staying away from bad always needs to come first. So now, says the Rebbe, we'll understand the difference in the orders. Why it is that the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch is changing from the way it's written in the Torah. In Torah Shebeksav, as well as in Torah Sheba'al Peh, if it's not in the area of halacha, so that would be like the Yerushalmi. So V'ga'alti and V'lokachti would come last, which is emphasizing what? The greatness of Torah. Because in Torah itself, in Torah Shebeksav and in Torah Sheba'al Peh, which one is going to be emphasized? The mile of Torah. And that's why the Torah ones come last, showing that that's the highest. However, in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, which is more the Chelek of halacha, psak din, ma'isa b'poil, practical action, there the Alter Rebbe would paskin that ha'ma'isa hu ha'ikar. We're focusing mainly on the mile of action. And therefore, when we're going in order from lowest to highest, that one's going to come last. And therefore, in the Alter Rebbe's order, he first says again, Voitseisi, which is the Sur Meirah. Then V'ga'alti v'lokachti, which is the two levels of Torah, and V'hitzalti, which is action, comes last. Another explanation, says the Rebbe. It says in Pri Eitz Chaim that the four koisos correspond to the four banim, the four children. And the order, as we know in the Haggadah, is Chacham, Rasha, Tam, and She'eino Yedei Alisha. In the Oilamos, this would be that Chacham would refer to Atzilus, the Rasha would refer to Asiya, the lowest world, and then the Tam and She'eino Yedei Alisha are Bria and Yitzira. So too in the order of the cups. The first cup of Kiddush corresponds to the Inyan of Atzilus. The second cup, we're telling the Haggadah, where we speak about how Metchila Hayu Oivdei Avodah Zarah, etc. Therefore, again, it's connected to the Rasha corresponding to Asiya. Then, as it's discussed in Kabbalah, how the third cup is connected to Berchas Hamazon in Bria, and the fourth one in Yitzira. In other words, the order of the four Lashonos of Geula Voitseisi v'hitzalti, V'ga'alti v'lokachti then, which is the order of the Koisos, would then be Atzilus, Asiya, Bria, and Yitzira. Again, the Chacham, the Rasha, and then the Tam and She'eino Yedei Alisha. Now, the reason why it is that we're putting the Rasha and the Haggadah right next to the Chacham, although seemingly it's out of order, the Rasha should seemingly be at the end, and Asiya should seemingly be at the end, is because we want the Rasha to be close to the Chacham, to be influenced by the Chacham. The Chacham is the one that can bring him to do tshuva. So too in the order of the Oilamos, says in Pri Eitz Chaim, why is it that Atzilus and Asiya are put next to each other over here? Because Asiya needs a very, very strong and powerful oil. He needs to be getting this oil from a very, very high place, from Atzilus. This is why in the Haggadah, which is about V'yigadeto levincha, we're trying to influence all four children, even the Ben Rasha. So the order, therefore, needs to be the Chacham, the Rasha, the Tam, and She'eino Yedei Alisha. And corresponding to that, the Koisos would then be looked at as Voitseisi v'hitzalti v'ga'alti v'lokachti. However, in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, he's ordering them according to the way it's Al Pi Shulchan Aruch. According to that, the order of the Daled Banim would be Chacham, Tam, She'eino Yedei Alisha, and then the Rasha. In other words, according to the mile of people, the Rasha would definitely be at the end. And in the order of cups, then it would come out again, Voitseisi, V'ga'alti v'lokachti, which would be the Chacham, the Tam, the She'eino Yedei Alisha, and putting the V'hitzalti, which is the Rasha, all the way at the end. The Rebbe concludes by saying, we know it says, Ki meitzeis cham eretz Mitzrayim aren neflois. Through our avodim, V'yigadeto levincha, dealing with all four children, that all of them should be on the level of Banim atem la Hashem Elokeichem. We will be zoicha to the four Lashonos of Geula, by the Geula, Amitis V'Ashleima B'Kariv Mamash.